Well, okay. Hello. Welcome. Episode 1 of the Our Blue Sky Minds podcast. I was trying to think of a name for this, and the only thing I can come up with is Taking the Leap. I've put this off for a long time for a number of reasons, but I'm glad to do it now. Some housekeeping before we get into it. I just want to point out that I have a website, ourblueskyminds.org. I've got a few different things going on there. I've got some recommended readings. I've put together a reading list of some of my favorite books, things that if you're interested in mental health, spirituality, curiosity, those books I think will be interesting to you. There are somewhat weekly articles. When I'm on top of it, it's weekly, but I've just finished graduate school, so you'll notice that there's a bit of an absence of articles for the past couple months. So I do apologize for that, but I am picking that back up, and it's going to feel good to get back into that. This will also be, you can find this podcast as well on the website. I've got a podcast page. That's where all future episodes will be uploaded to. You'll also find a store, which is a bit lacking currently, but there will be additions made in the next couple of weeks. So this week, I just wanted to introduce myself, I guess. My name is Liam Hopkins Beaupre. I'm a recent graduate of a master's program from King's College London, where I got my master's in the psychology and neuroscience of mental health. It's been quite a fascinating 2-year journey, and it's a bittersweet thing to be finished that. You'll have to forgive me here. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. So we got the intros out of the way. I hope all of those were recorded and saved correctly. So I want to get into what we have going on for this week's episode. I want to talk about something that I covered in this week's article which you can find on the website. We titled it "Many Faces of Depression," and how many ways depression can be expressed and manifest. I think there's an opinion, or at least a perception that when we talk about depression, we're talking about one thing, and it always looks the same. And I think the research and anecdotes both disagree with that. The more we come to learn about depression, the more we understand that we might be talking about something that's got many discrete forms that have all fallen under the same umbrella. Now, that may not be a problem on its face, but maybe by the end of this episode you'll understand why it might be a problem, to have that low resolution perspective. So you can find the article. I'd recommend giving the article a read. It's going to be a little bit more in-depth in some ways and less in-depth than what we cover here. So let's get into it. So when we talk about depression, what exactly are we talking about there? Are we talking about something that is, you've got low mood, impacted mood, lowered motivation? Those are going to be the two primary components that define depression, at least in the public eye: reduced mood and reduced motivation. But believe it or not, there are kinds of depression where you may not have both of those. The DSM does define depression as at least being characterized by low mood. That's sort of like a required criteria of the diagnosis. And then there are 9 other symptoms listed in the DSM, at least for major depressive disorder. And what you'll see when you look at the DSM is that there isn't just MDD, major depressive disorder, which is what probably comes to mind if you've got any background knowledge in this. I have to apologize for any video watchers here. It's hot today. I'm not doing well. It's hot. And all the technical difficulties, it's got me. Got me sweating. All right, so I apologize for that. Okay, hopefully that is the last technical difficulty. Let's get into it before something happens again. Okay. So this week's article, titled "Many Faces of Depression," I wanted to analyze and sort of question the way we understand depression. Often when you hear people talk about depression, they say, well, depression, right? We're talking about one thing that's probably got a rough form that, 9 people out of 10 could point out, yep, that's depression, what we're looking at there. Probably something that's characterized by low mood, low motivation, or like just changes in behavior, maybe sort of a listlessness or anhedonia, which reduced motivation or pleasure. That's what most of us would think about when we think about depression. But there are other kinds of depression. There are depressions that are characterized by elevated anxiety, reduced anxiety, like fatigue, like super depressed physiology, right? We've got lots of fatigue, sort of on the opposite end of anxiety. So depression can come in a lot of different forms and a lot of different causes. So over the next 10, 15 minutes, I want to go over some of those quite quickly. Again, I'm not sure if it was caught in the before or after the technical difficulty, but you can find this article on the website, ourblueskyminds.org. Should be up at by the time this is live. So, depression. We're talking about a group of disorders. So, moving forward, I want to rename those the depressions, plural, right? We've got a few different disorders here. Primarily, the DSM recognizes major depressive disorder, which is probably the most common or well-known one, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, persistent depressive disorder, also known as dysthymia, and we have a dysregulated mood or disruptive mood dysregulation disorder. So these are all sort of different forms, different phenotypes of depression, but then what's really interesting and what the point of this episode here is, within each of those diagnoses, there's variation, there's phenotypes, and that matters. and we'll look into why. So we're just going to briefly look over MDD. I want to hone in on that because that's sort of the most well-known depression. When we talk about depression, that's what most people think about. So the DSM has got MDD defined, or at least it's characterized, or some criteria that you need to express to meet a diagnosis is you need 5 of 9 possible symptoms, with one of those symptoms, at least one of those symptoms, being low or depressed mood most of the time, which is what most people, that required symptom, the depressed mood, that's what most people think of, right? Reduced mood. But there are 8 or 9 other symptoms, mostly preoccupied with increases and decreases in feeding behaviors and appetite. So your appetite can either be increased or decreased. Sleep, you can either be hyper somnolent, which is like you sleep a lot, or you're in insomnia. Insomniac, you've got reduced sleeping. So you can move both of those directions. Eat, sleep, and movement, which is you can have an increase or decrease in movement. Okay, this is honestly starting to feel like a joke with how many difficulties. But you know what? We're resilient and we're stubborn, so we're going to push on through. I don't know where that ended. I think we got the increases and decreases to sleep, feeding, and movement. Okay, so those are 3 symptoms. I'm not sure how deep we are in. Recurrent thoughts of death. Not necessarily suicide, but just thinking about death. Reduced motivation, fatigue. What is that? Are we at? I think that's all of them. Have we missed any? They're on the website, okay? You can go find them. So in order to reach a diagnosis for MDD, you need 5 of 9 of those symptoms, with at least one of them being depressed mood most or all of the time. So something interesting that may not be obvious right off the bat is that if you need 5 of 9 That means that you can have, I mean, if we did some really quick math, we could look at least a few different variations, right? You can have some depressions where there's fatigue present, other depressions where there isn't fatigue present. You can have depressions with fatigue and reduced sleep, or depression with no fatigue and increased sleep. All these different combinations of symptoms, right? And so if we do actually some pretty quick math, we can find, interestingly enough, with outcome calculations, how many ways 5 can go into 9, can make 256 different forms. I think that's pretty wild, and I'm not sure if that really translates well or means what I think it means, or that people are going to understand, is that there could be upwards of 256 different kinds of depression. If we think of depressions that are characterized by sets of symptoms, there could be upwards of 256 uniquely defined and uniquely characterized kinds of depression. That's pretty wild, because if you go into a physician's office, which is the last place you want to be if you're trying to get your depression fixed, but it's where most of us end up first. That's just by the way the medical field works. We get referred to our physician first. Not only do they have abysmally low psychology training, next to none actually, they'll just say, oh, you have depression, and you get an antidepressant and maybe some psychotherapy, some talk therapy. They'll refer you to a skilled clinician. But the fact that you could be walking in there with one of 256 discrete forms of this disease, but you get the same treatment, that's problematic. And I hope you sort of realize that, right? Like, wait, well, that doesn't make sense. If you think of something like cancer, for instance, we recognize when we say cancer, the next question or the next thing after that is what kind? And it matters to physicians because that determines the treatment. What kind? A glioblastoma is not going to get the same treatment as Hodgkin's lymphoma. But if you go into a physician's office, or I mean even a psychologist or a psychiatrist, you have depression, you get the same treatment. You and 256 other individuals who may have all these different discrete forms of depression, they all get the same treatment. Or at least the first primary approach, right? We're going to try a SSRI, maybe something that's got hopefully something that's got a lot of evidence behind it. Maybe we'll look at family history, so we could look at like maybe drugs that have worked for family in the past. If you have a history of mental illness in your family, that can be useful. But if you're the first one in the family, it can take some work to find that right drug. And it makes sense, because if we're talking about 256 different diseases that all are characterized by low mood, but there's discrete and distinct characteristics of those, that's interesting. I'm not sure there's anything else in medicine where there are so many different forms of it, yet it gets one treatment. If you know of anything, let me know, because I'd be interested to hear. Psychiatry tends to have its blinders on, at least in relation to medicine. Psychiatry's got a different story going on. So if we have 256 different forms of a disease, that makes treatment difficult, because it not only makes the diagnosis difficult, which kind of depression, right? Are we going to have 256 names or phenotypes of depression? That also makes treatment difficult, like we were just saying. Interestingly enough, actually, you look at you take antidepressants, for instance, you look at the success rates of antidepressants, and in recent papers, you'll look at it, and we'll have some in the show notes for this podcast, where you'll see a success rate of 20 to 75%. 20 to 75%. I hope your eyebrows raise at that, because unless you've done some pre-reading or you understand the statistics, that doesn't make much sense. How could something work 20 to 75% of the time? It's almost like we've applied it across a number of different contexts, so we get inconsistent findings. It's like we're trying to treat a bunch of different diseases with one medication, and because of that, we're getting different success rates. So in moments or in studies where they show higher success rate, was that luck? Did they just happen to find the drug that matched the particular constellation of symptoms that those participants were suffering from? Just for an example, this is not represented specifically in the science, but just as an example, antidepressants say something like sertraline. Let's say sertraline is exceptional at addressing fatigue and motivation. Okay, just by happenstance, it addresses motivation. So say it's got some dopaminergic activity, so that can assist in elevating your motivation, and fatigue. So it's got dopamine can address both of those. But then if you've got another person with depression and they're coming in with, maybe they've got psychomotor agitation, they've got lots of anxiety and they can't stop moving. If you elevate their dopamine, you're risking making it worse. You're risking making their agitation worse. You're risking their, you can really push people into some really dangerous situations if you aren't being careful with how you're treating the disease. And if you don't know what disease you're treating, how are you going to treat that successfully? So back to the 20 to 70%, 75% success rates. I think Sex Panther has a better rate than that, right? What does he say? 60% of the time? It works 100% of the time? Antidepressants don't even work that often. So, maybe you've got a better chance of just trying out some new cologne. Being facetious, I don't mean that for real. So I found that interesting. I wanted to share that with you guys. That depression can come in so many different forms, and it's all got the same name. So moving forward, I want people to start calling it the depressions. But I want us to recognize that it's a class of disorders and not just one, and not a class of disorders recognized by the DSM, MDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder, all the ones that we were mentioning before. I'm talking about within diagnostic variation. There's multiple forms of one diagnosis. And that's not to dig on diagnostic psychiatry. It is a little bit. We're nuanced in some ways and then very low resolution in other ways. I think we could benefit from flipping that around a bit. And then I wanted to talk about a paper by Drysdale from 2017, Drysdale and colleagues, 2017. And I'm going to pull that up actually right here just so I can follow along here. The paper's called Resting State Connectivity, Biomarkers Define Neurophysiological Subtypes of Depression. So this was written in 2017, which would have been pretty cutting edge to be recognizing subtypes of depression at that point. It's a fairly new concept, mostly because it's come out of combining data from questionnaires that we give, that patients are given, and that can define, and we can start to sort out their symptoms. And we can use other means now, mostly imaging, brain imaging, which has been really valuable in this paper specifically. So what they did was that they paired the answers that people would fill out on questionnaires, mood questionnaires. They would questions like, in the past week, I felt low, never, sometimes, always, often, something like that, right? Maybe not in that order. They can match answers from those questions with data from, in this state, or in this case, resting state MRI. So they've got you in imaging, and they're looking at how your brain is operating at rest, which means that they're not asking you questions, you're not looking at anything in particular, you're just sort of at rest, no particular cognitive task happening. So they can look at how your brain looks at rest and how you answered on a questionnaire, and with 82 to 93% certainty predict how you'll respond to treatments. That's pretty incredible. And I think that's sort of a foot in the door and a way that we're going to address what we were just talking about before, these 256 discrete forms of depression. If we can administer a questionnaire, get a rough idea of what's going on psychologically, and then also pair it with something like imaging, where we can measure the physiology, measure what's happening under the hood, what's happening in the brain. We can pair those together and start to identify. Maybe we could shave off 100 possible options, right? They definitely don't have 100 of these phenotypes. That's huge. You know, almost a 35% shave off, right? That's great. And interestingly, they found that although, you know, they found some really interesting things, and one of those was that the biotypes couldn't be differentiated solely based on clinical features. So like what I was saying before, based on the questionnaires, those aren't sufficient in predicting what kind of depression you have, right? If you gave 100 or let's say 256 people with depression, this questionnaire, clinical questionnaire, that wouldn't be enough to determine whether which kind of phenotype of depression they have. You would also need some imaging data to go along with that to see which areas of the brain are active and not active at rest. You can pair those together and you can sort of see, okay, so there's maybe some metabolic characteristics that are happening here. Certain parts of the brain are quiet. And we also happen to notice, oh, okay, so just as an example, and I mentioned this in the paper, something like motivation, so low motivation. Let's take something a little bit easier, like feeding behaviors. So we know the feeding behaviors are primarily carried out by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is primarily motivated by food, or at least feeding behaviors. In depression, in imaging anyways, we'll see that the hypothalamus of depressed individuals can have reduced metabolism. So this might explain why they would have reduced appetite, right? Reduced feeding behaviors, because their brain is not telling them to go out and get food. So you start to see the weight loss and reduced feeding that's characteristic of some kinds of depression. And by looking at that in imaging and pairing it with questionnaires, now we can start to see, okay, so this individual has maybe a hypothalamic mediated reduction of appetite, okay? And that could tell us a lot. So now we know that maybe the hypothalamus is affected, or areas that are feeding into or feeding off hypothalamus inputs, something of the network that the hypothalamus is a part of could be impacted. And that could tell us a lot, and that could really direct treatment. That could really help us out in discovering not only what kind of depression you have, but how to treat it. So I found that interesting. We're gonna tuck into this a little bit more over the next few weeks, but I wanted to sort of point out this seminal finding here, or one of the original questions by Drysdale, who was pointing out how depression can come in different forms. And what he found, or what they found rather, he was part of a big team, is that they found, let me pull up this page here, they found 4 primary biotypes of depression. The first one, biotype 1, was characterized by anxiety, insomnia, and fatigue. Okay, so those are the 3 symptoms that stood out most in biotype 1. Biotype 2 was exhaustion and low energy. Pretty similar, but different in important ways. Biotype 3 was an inability to feel pleasure, anhedonia, as well as slowed movements and speech. And biotype 4, mostly characterized by anxiety with insomnia, along with the inability to feel pleasure. And interestingly, so these 4 biotypes appeared and were delineated based on brain activity. So we can tell which one of these 4 camps you would fall in based on your resting state, or what your brain looked like at rest in an MRI machine. I find that pretty interesting. It lends its hand towards this idea that hopefully will emerge in medicine and psychiatry over the next few years, is personalized medicine. Right now we've got a marginally personalized medicine. We use questionnaires to sort of determine which, like a very low resolution, like do you have depression, or do you have bipolar or schizophrenia, right? That's a pretty open perspective, or bird's eye view perspective. as personalized medicine becomes more and more pervasive, the perspective is going to get much closer. It's going to be much more specific. We're going to start looking at genes that orchestrate the way your brain is developed, and that might be leading to the symptoms that you're suffering from, and and how to treat those. Personalized medicine is going to be a pretty cool thing. We're gonna hopefully talk about that a little bit more over the next few weeks. Well, that's great. I wanted to just do a quick podcast today, just as a first episode, give you a little idea of what to expect in the coming episodes. Hopefully the production value gets a bump. There will be guests as well, so I won't have to bore you all on my own. I will have help, hopefully fairly frequently. So with that, thanks for listening. I appreciate that. If you made it all the way, I really do appreciate it. If you could leave a comment and like this video, that would be great. If you're on YouTube, if you're on Spotify, you could leave a little review or rating. I would absolutely appreciate it. And you can find the article again at www.ourblueskyminds.org/articles. It'll be that first one there. There will be a new article every week, so if you are listening to this episode later, just scroll down there and look for the many faces of depression. Cool, guys. Well, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.